Now, diverse cultures make it more difficult to hold elites accountable as they can endlessly play groups off each other. Now, majority groups, along with minorities, lose out while political elites dine sumptuously. Now, these are the views of an independent strategy advisor, Sean Hedgedorn. So, will Africa's growth be faster if cultural tensions are mitigated? Well, Godfrey Mutizwe spoke to him to answer that question.
Welcome to the program, Sean. I mean, we have written about something that is difficult to really hold it, make it tangible, if you like. You're talking about culture, you're talking about business, and you're talking about how we mesh the two and make them successful, and how successful communities and cultures through the years have been able to adapt. But where do we begin? Let's start perhaps with an understanding of how you develop that winning culture, if you like, the one that supersedes everyone's to the extent that the world then follows it.
Right. So I would think the really key word there would be adaptation, because economically the global economy is changing so rapidly that while everyone today is a product of a successful culture, the reasons that their cultures have succeeded is because they've adapted when they've needed to.
Mm. But Sean, how do you then distinguish between the development of a business culture and the evolution or development as well of a broader culture in which that business operates?
Okay, well, people are going to have different opinions about that, depending on what their priorities are. A lot of people, economists for instance, and I'm very influenced by economists, they're going to say that culture has always been extremely influenced by economics, even long before the word was ever invented. Because if you think about it, they're going to say that survival was always about basic economics. So I don't think an economist is going to make as big a distinction between business culture and a core culture.
Yeah. Now, let's put this into context. The reason why we're talking about this is we're trying to understand where South Africa is going as a country and the focus and priorities that our government has given to some of its business as well as economic policies. Where do you think the South African government, and perhaps what we're trying to do is to understand the ideology that's driving the African National Congress as a governing party in terms of how it wants to try to take the country forward economically. Where do you think they are going wrong, and where do you think they are founding their principles from?
Okay. Well, their principles were founded within a struggle movement. So a lot of their culture reflects that. And of course, that's a lot different than governing. Governing is pretty similar around the world in that you have a lot of different factions that you have to keep satisfied, and then you have to keep an economy going that can compete in the rest of the world. And you know, a lot of people know more about that in particular than I do, will say that struggle culture is not ideal. It's a difficult transition, but 20 years into it, I mean, it's a different, the ANC is a different organization than it was 25 years ago. So they've certainly adapted.
Yeah, they have adapted, but what are you saying?
Not enough, but yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly the point that I was going to make. Are you saying they have successfully adapted that struggle culture into the business or the economic culture that's required to try to drive this economy forward?
No, they're focused on politics, and there was a huge disconnect there. I mean, to really jump into the thick of it is that ideally the business and the political cultures would complement each other, but you have a highly diverse society, and politically that's very tempting because you can always play, in effect, the race card, because, again, just jumping right into it, if you have to cross ethnic lines, it's difficult to criticize constructively. You know, it's easier for a white commentator to criticize a white government, a black commentator to criticize a black government. As soon as you cross the line, it becomes more difficult. And that's where a lot of the conversation becomes a bit disconnected. And if all you were concerned about was politically, you would certainly, your advisors would tell you to exploit that. And that happens every day.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying, because I was reading a headline in the Mail and Guardian, and they were referring to what they were saying. The ANC, the headline went something along the lines, the ANC is not listening to itself. And it's interesting they put that headline like that, because in part what you are saying is that if the ANC was listening to itself and adapting, we wouldn't be having the, how shall we put it, economic political difficulties that we are currently having, because they can't sort of quite clearly enunciate what economic policy is, because they are also trying to pay attention to their struggle history.
Yeah, that's a big background point. And then what you have, and I'll speak in very general terms,
Yeah.
you know, if you look at the foreign policy of a lot of countries, they're almost always a bit incoherent because you have different factions. You know, you have the hawks and the doves, you have people have different ideas about how foreign policy should be affected by economics. So you have different opinions, you have different factions, so you get incoherent policy responses. So that's kind of what you get when you have a diverse group of people who are contributing to the governing process.
Yeah, but clearly,
it's
surely
not one person calling the shots.
Yeah, but that's how it's how you manage it, isn't it? Because I mean, you look all around the world, and I think there has been research that suggests that diversity actually is a strength. And yet you write in your latest piece that, and I'm quoting you here verbatim, diverse cultures make it more difficult to hold elites accountable, as they can endlessly play groups off each other. But what about the strength of diversity? Where has that gone?
Right, so that's actually where the article goes, is to make the point that like South Africa should just look around and say, look, everyone's culture is a successful culture. It's because whatever circumstances people dealt with over really many, many generations, they coped. I mean, there were a lot of people alive 10,000 years ago, say, whose genes have not been passed forward. Their cultures failed. Okay, so everyone who's alive today, their culture is a success, all 7.2 billion people on the planet. However, a lot of what made those cultures successful in the past was they adapted when they needed to, and now the rate of adapting has to be a lot faster because a lot of technological change. And the other really big point, or two big points, one is we're going from the industrial era to the information era, which means much faster adaptation. And then also the other one, whatever you want to call it, global integration, globalization, the rise of the East, that also creates a lot of demands on cultures adapting. And one of the points of the article is the experts predict that half of the languages spoken today will die out in the next 30 years or so. So, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of adaptation as the world globalizes and we move into the information age.
Yeah. So the point you are making is that it is a struggle for South Africa's ruling party to make this adaptation or to make this leap forward.
I mean, I make a little bit of a finer point of it in that politically it benefits them because, again, if I was a political consultant, I could say, look, you can really take advantage of this. And quite frankly, I mean, to get a little bit more specific, I mean, the DA now, the more black the leadership of the DA becomes, the easier it is for them to criticize. I mean, it really is across the world. I mean, Sunnis criticizing Shias doesn't go over very well. When there are ethnic divisions, criticism is easy to block politically.
And one of the most interesting points you also make is that South Africa ought to realize actually that the world in which it operates has been defined by bigger factors than it. And you mentioned three of them. You talk about the global economy and the massive core of integrated and dynamic economies. Then you talk about the advancement of technology. And thirdly, you talk about the fact that those cultures that are successful are actually well suited for the future rather than looking backwards like people constantly do here to the founding document of the ANC, which is the Freedom Charter.
Right, and so obviously there has to be a balance. You know, a constitution, a charter, those things are very helpful, and then you build on those. But if you listen to the ANC and a lot of their proclamations and where they expect to go by creating millions of jobs and industrialization and black industrialists and things like that, the reality is that's the past. Maybe that would have been great 30 years ago, 20 years ago. Yeah. Those things are completely out of date. You know, the other point that the article goes to in terms of global integration is the rise of the East has basically been about selling finished goods to the West. Because the West industrialized first, that's where most of the world's disposable income is. So that has benefited the East tremendously. Now, to develop a tremendous amount of wealth, South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, should be first at what is going to be new in the evolving economy of the next 2 or 3 decades, not what worked in the past. And the industrial era is clearly ending. The evidence is overwhelming.
Yeah. So advise the ANC and other African ruling parties, if you will, in terms of understanding how to marry that very rich struggle past and that very important struggle past into the current realities.
Right. So a lot of the best examples are in the East, and they had their struggles as well. But at some point, you have to say, are we going to integrate into the global economy or not? And if your country is geologically endowed with a lot of natural resources, it's tempting not to do that. It's tempting for the ruling elite to say, well, hang on, we'll just export a lot of stuff. We, as a ruling elite, will live well, and we won't invest in our people. But you can see, I mean, a good example actually is the Middle East, where you see, say, in the Emirates or in Qatar, however you want to say that,
yeah.
that they're shifting their model and they're investing more and more in their people. It's not easy to do. It's not easy to come up with a model. But if you don't do that, and then as we're starting to see now, there's just an OPEC meeting last week, and there's some amazing things said in that OPEC meeting, yeah, where a lot of the big oil and gas producers are talking about a carbon tax. They're actually arguing in favor of it. The world's changing very rapidly, and you don't want to rely on minerals and energy deposits.
That was Sean Hagedorn, an independent strategy advisor.